Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 35. I am your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're excited to have with us the award-winning NCAA Division I hockey coach turned Vermont author, Gary Wright.
Thanks, Barney. It's great to be here.
Gary, yeah, it was great chatting with you. I know you got your book published through Rootstock Publishing, correct? Mm-hmm. Right. So as we said, you were a Division I hockey coach. You were a hockey coach for well on 40 years.
Yeah.
And one of the things is that your mother, who recently passed, who was also a writing teacher, kind of basically told you should write a book, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I had done a one that I self-published called Pass the Biscuit back around 1991, which was more of an X&O book. But yes, I don't think I would have taken on this endeavor. But my mother really sort of stayed on me pretty regularly. I guess just from the stories I had told her, that kind of thing through the years or whatever. But yeah, I don't think I would have undertaken it otherwise. And she worked with me a little bit on it, which was kind of interesting.
You know? And so you don't see a lot of ice hockey memoir books out there. There's not like a big section in the bookstore for that. My first question for you as well is, like, how was your process? How did you decide what were you going to put into it? And what did you decide what you had to cut out afterwards?
Sure. Well, I think one of the advantages that I had when she asked, or, when she was kind of, bringing it up quite with some regularity, is that I guess I've always been a little bit of a pack rat, and I have saved a lot of stuff from all my years as a player and as a coach, like I don't know, several boxes anyhow. And I had done a little bit of writing before, as I mentioned to you, with that self-published, and it's always interested me, particularly being around her. And it's in my family too. My sister teaches at Middlebury College, and my brother-in-law is an English teacher, professor at Champlain College. So it's always been a little bit, around me. My father was a hockey coach, and that's how the reason I gravitated there. And my sisters and brothers gravitated a little bit more towards my mother on maybe the literary side or the English side or whatever. But basically, I just started just a few months after I got through coaching, and lived for one more year down in Springfield, and started it down there, and then continued. I probably wrote about 75% of it up here in Vermont. Most of it, at least in the summer, all of it either on my back porch or on the waterfront at our lake camp. Right. And interestingly about that too, I read a sort of a partial interview, I think it was in Time magazine, with a new poet laureate, and she talked about the value of writing outside. And I had already, sort of done. It's just interesting, and sort of independent of that, I've just always sort of enjoyed either being on the porch or out in the yard or whatever. So, and my mother was a little bit involved. As I would finish each chapter, I would show it to my mother, and I would also show it. I had a very good, I guess I had some really good access for being on the athletic side. I had my mother, and one of my best friends was an English professor there. So I would give each of them would, come back with some comments, and my mother actually, she would point out some grammatical errors or suggestions, that kind of thing. But a lot of it was almost being like a coach. I like that, or oh no, or whatever the case. But so that's kind of basically. And the other thing I think too, Arnie, is I wasn't sure if I could sit still this long or that long. And so I didn't have a regimen. A lot of times writers will get up and 8 o'clock in the morning and work till noon or whatever in their writing room. But I just sort of did it here, there, and everywhere.
Right. How much of your memoir do you feel is specific history, and how much of it is filtered through nostalgia?
Well, one thing that was really interesting, I probably talked to, either by email or quasi interview, calling people on the phone or meeting with them or whatever, probably 40 or 50 different people. And one of the interesting things talking about memory is, boy, sometimes you talk about something that happened 30 years ago, and sometimes one guy says we lost that game and the other says we won that game. And if the record book is still around, which there is in most cases, but there were a couple things in prep school that people just had different memories of it. I think that one of the great things about talking to a lot of different people is if I hadn't, I still could have written that book, but there's just a lot of sort of things in that maybe I wouldn't have remembered or wouldn't have even known about, one of my, for instance, when we were up here playing Middlebury in the championship game in 1990, when one of my players got up and talked about Churchill's speech. And I never even knew he did that until 30 years later, 28 years later, whatever it was. And he's a lawyer up in Toronto and a trial lawyer on top of that. So even back then he was and he wasn't even a captain, but anyhow, he got up because his father had told him, the never give up speech from Winston Churchill. And I didn't even, until I talked to Bill Taggart about that 3 years ago, it just never came up anywhere. So right. In some cases some of that stuff, there's little nuggets people tell you that really, I think, enhance the book that I wouldn't have really known otherwise. And in terms of the nostalgic, there's certainly an element of that. I kind of felt like sometimes like I was right back in the moment when I was writing this.
Right. And how was that? Because you're saying you're writing outside. Is there something that kind of takes you out of the memory if you're writing outside on a warm day and you're talking about hockey?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Geez, there's a pretty good, there's a guy who wrote a couple of hockey books, and one of them was about having a rink out, building rinks outdoors. And I think I quoted his wife in the book. He said one of the best lines he ever heard was from his wife. He said, "To love summer is one thing, but to love winter, you have to bring a little bit of your sunshine around with you." I don't know. I just enjoy being on the porch, and I just think it's a really nice setting. I can't say that I'm necessarily overly inspired by it. Right. But there is something sort of relaxing about it, and just about being outside, not just inside your house. At least for me, it was. Yeah.
Right. I mean, because you spent, as we said earlier, you spent 40 years coaching. You're at Rice Memorial, you're at the University of Maine, and then you're at the American International College. Now, if somebody's going to be sitting down and actually, reading your book. So if anybody's interested, so definitely check it out. So Striding Rough Ice, Coaching College Hockey and Growing Up in the Game. Now, do you have this book split up as chronologically? Like there's going to be a part of it about Rice Memorial, then a part of it about University of Maine, then a chunk of it about American International College. How did you split up the book?
Well, to give my mother a little more credit again, she, when I started, I just assumed I would start with growing up on the prep school campus and then gravitate into being a player there. And my mother had said, no, you should start in the moment, something more recent that catches the reader's attention, and then sort of go back and start from the beginning. And then in the end can be as if that chapter just came after the first one. I segmented it, by, the second chapter was growing up on the campus and playing at Proctor Academy. And then the next one was playing at UVM and then coaching at Rice and then going to Maine. So I would say probably, almost 50% of it, maybe a little less, maybe 45% of the book is about, my experiences at AIC, and the others are a mixture of different places.
Now, because you've been coaching, I'm really curious about this. Is like with just the evolution of sports science over the last several decades, like you being there for 40 years, how has coaching differed? How is that occupation different than it was over the past 40 years?
Well, the game has changed, and I think a little bit what you were inferring there. like players in this day and age are much more concerned about their diets.
Hmm.
There's a much different, much more. I think you used the term scientific. For instance, 30 years ago, having a sports psychologist work with my players, or going to a yoga instructor,
Hmm.
those kind of things probably, in a macho type sport wouldn't have been received as well. But now it's these kids, and there's such an emphasis, on the scientific part of it, as you mentioned.
Right.
I think that has certainly changed. I was at the college level, so there's a real educational bend, which I find attractive. It's almost, I like, it's not the same as an academic course, but it's almost an extension of the classroom. And there's just so much more. The recruiting is more involved. The recruiting is more, extensive. The game is just developed. I mean,
Hmm.
30 years ago, well, maybe when I was in college, we didn't watch much film, and now film is very much a big part of the coaching process.
Right. And so yeah, as you did mention about that, I know that you mentioned earlier that recruiting is a big part of being a coach, and you didn't like doing recruiting that much.
Well, that was, yeah. There was an article that I don't know if that came out quite the way I intended it.
Okay.
No, what I kind of meant there is when I stopped. Now that I'm not coaching anymore, I don't miss certain aspects of the recruiting. Pounding the phones, talking to high school age kids who are a little bit older, like night after night, and maybe the long trips. But there's also things about coaching, like, I like having weekends off, that kind of thing now. So I wouldn't, but I don't think I was, as dogged a recruiter as some. And so I think there's some, that there's some, that makes some sense. But
Right.
it wasn't that I didn't like it. But I think most coaches, though, still would say, the games and the practices and that sort of thing. They like recruiting, but it's not as favorable to them as coaching it, on the bench, or just playing the game and coaching the game.
Right. Now that you're retired and now you've published a book, do you have other colleagues that are coaches that are retired who's like, Gary, wow, that's amazing, you wrote a book, I could never write a book?
Well,
What's your response to
I've
that?
heard people say that, yeah, whether they're coach or not. Yeah, I always just tell them the same thing I told you. I don't know if I didn't know if I could sit around that long, but yeah, I mean, they've been a big help. I mean, a lot of guys that are coaches that are friends of mine, have read it, and have sort of helped promote it on their own Twitter feeds or whatever. And I had a number of assistants through the years, and they're all scattered. I mean, like, for instance, just this past weekend when UVM was playing UNH, one of the UVM assistants was with me, and the guy on the other bench, one of the UNH assistants, coached with me at one time. So
Yeah.
most of them have read it, obviously. I haven't had too many. There's a couple, like anything you do, I didn't want to write like a complete puff piece,
Right.
but I wasn't going to get on, I wasn't going to be unreasonable at all. I'm not trying to anything like any kind of tell all or something silly like that. But, there's a couple things in there where I'll mention a player was a little bit more difficult to coach or something like that. I haven't heard anything directly back, but we'll see.
Yeah. Now, what is your advice to people who would say, I don't know if I can write my own memoir, Gary? What would be your advice to somebody like that?
Um, well, you're absolutely right. It is the genre of memoir. I sort of call it a sports memoir. Um, I don't. I'm not sure what the term I'm looking for here, but I don't. It seems a little bit. I guess I'm a little bit more modest than to think a whole lot of people are going to want to read my memoir. Um, but also, so I've kind of, it is a lot about myself, but it's very much about the people and players, that touched me along the way. I would say, and that question has been asked. I always, the people that have brought up with me, I said, you might really enjoy it even if you don't get it published. It's a pretty neat experience. It really fascinated me. Because one of the things about it too, Barney, is that when I coached, I was always away from the rink thinking about it, whether I'm driving in a car or lying in bed at night or whatever. And what really interested me is I found the same sort of thing when I was writing this book. I was always writing down notes in the car and thinking about it and looking forward at times to sit down and write, whereas before I never had before.
And Ian, that was going to be my next question, is like, what skills did you hone and craft an expertise as a coach that you saw was translated pretty easily as an author?
I guess the focus, the discipline, there's an element of of just doggedness, getting up and doing it, and the creative aspect too. One of the reasons that I thought I might be able to be a decent writer, and I've done a fair amount of public speaking, and it's always been received reasonably well. And it's kind of like, it's probably like anything, like you constructing the questions you're asking now, or me writing a speech, or to some extent you're writing it. I mean, you can ad lib to a point. So I think there's those kind of, on the other hand, the writing's a little more lonely. If you're coaching, you're just constantly surrounded by people. And not that I felt lonely, but it's a little bit more solitary. And one of the things I said originally is, well, I've always liked to have written. I don't know if I'm going to like the actual process. But this became fun. Like, I don't know. That is one thing about this. It became, I actually looked forward to doing it. Whereas a lot of times if you have to prepare something, like whether it's a homework assignment or whatever, that's just like drudgery.
Right.
And so a lot of the writing I had done, we want you to turn in a budget. We want you to do this or that, or prepare something for, the department or whatever, or we need all your NCAA, stuff that those kind of things. I would kind of like, kind of procrastinate with it, but I didn't with this. The more I got into it, the more I sort of enjoyed it,
Right. Now, talk about the process. So you wrote the manuscript. Did you already identify rootstock before, or did you write it and then trying to find a publisher to help you out?
The only thing I knew is I hoped to get it published because I had done the self-publishing before, and it was even more work and it was harder to circulate. Of course, that was before the internet age too. No, I just submitted it to, and some of these big publishers, I think you even have to have an agent. You know what I'm saying? I just submitted it to Rootstock and sort of held my breath because I didn't see that they had been doing a whole lot of sports books.
Right.
And it made sense. And a guy who's a good friend of mine around here said one or two other people had mentioned it to him that were writers, that they were small and not as well known and fairly new, but pretty good. So I think they kind of were perfect for. I don't think I wasn't going to get one of the big five coming out of the gate. It's not like I had some big reputation as a writer or something.
So how different was your manuscript as compared to the finished product? How much was there a lot of editing that happened during that whole process?
No, I didn't feel like a ton,
Okay.
some, and it was helpful. One of the things I guess that sort of got me over the hump is they had, I think, one of their part-time people who was also a sports writer.
Oh, cool.
Montpelier Bay area. But he wrote about it. He read it and wrote about a 2 or 3 just general essay report and was pretty impressed with it. And I think that's kind of what triggered them to make the decision. So,
right.
And it fit too the fact that they're in Vermont. I like that as well.
Right. Yeah. And so what were some of the things that you were surprised about the feedback that you've gotten from it for folks that are non-hockey fans?
a number of people have mentioned that it's fairly well written, and I guess I've never really thought of myself as a writer per se. So I guess that's kind of nice. And I'm a big Ken Dryden fan. He was a great player for the Montreal Canadiens
Okay.
and won a bunch of Stanley Cups, a goalie, and also became a lawyer and was also in Parliament and has written about his, how it's a little bit, arbitrary, but how they'll have these lists of the 25 best sports books ever written. Well, there's
Right.
one hockey book that always gets in there, and that's The Game, which is a book that Ken Dryden wrote. And he's written he's a hockey guy, but he's essentially a writer too. But he's always been a guy that I've kind of looked up in that area.
Mm.
But in terms of yeah, and I guess I've been a little encouraged that, whether it's family members or friends or, I've had a couple friends read it that are not hockey people, and assuming that hopefully I don't want them to tell me they like it if they don't, just to be nice. But I think that I think there's enough. I think if you're a sports person that plays another sport, I think you can still like this. And but at least some people that aren't really in athletics at all, at least have been able to get through it without saying it was like pulling teeth or anything.
Right. Because that's a good point. So just to be clear, you don't have to know anything about hockey to enjoy this book.
No, it helps to have, it helps to have some knowledge, but yeah, it isn't an X. There's an X and OL. As a matter of fact, Barney, the guy who was reading it along with after I wrote it each time, I was telling you, there's an English professor. He's a big sports fan.
Mm.
And about 3 chapters in, he said to me, I'm glazing I like it, but my eyes are just glazing over a little bit when you get into that too much X and O stuff. The right wing is here and the left wing is there. And so I dialed it back.
Okay.
Realizing I should keep some of that in because it's very much a part of the game, but not overdo that. And that was probably one of the better insight that I got. So it's a good question.
Right. Because you had to make sure that it's, accessible to all readers, because thinking about it as a memoir, do you also look at it based off of mostly your personal journey or just the historical context of what was happening in college hockey over the last several years?
I think it's a little bit of both. I was always writing with the idea that, to some sense, it has to be entertaining. It has to be something somebody's going to want to read. I think it's sort of filled with anecdotes and side stories and a big emphasis again on, the people that have sort of touched me along the way. And I tried to, like in that first chapter, the West Point weekend, I tried to throw some, I didn't just mention hockey. I mentioned that historic football stadium they had there. And was it Douglas MacArthur or whoever, a quote from him. So I tried to, one of the things that was a little bit interesting is Bill Beanie, who is the Middlebury College hockey coach. And he's the one he's got the record, I think, for national championships at any level in hockey. And, he had mentioned, he goes, yeah, it's even got a little bit of a history book in it. So I think that's something I did consciously,
Right.
But the biggest thing, was probably the human element, I think. And one of the things that you said earlier, which is true, and it's one of the things that particularly, it was part of my process when I was thinking, am I going to do something like this? And that's that there aren't that many, certainly at the college level in hockey, there haven't been that many memoirs,
Right.
And at the NHL level more, but not a whole lot. I mean, they've often been, there's been another writer writing about a coach, that kind of thing. There's been some, but not a ton. So I did think that might be something that might give me, a little bit of a niche here.
Right. Was there anything that you had written out in the first draft that you really liked, a really good story or anecdote that your editors or your friends say, "No, Gary, cut this out. This is going on a different trip. Let's cut that out."
Who do you think you are? No, I would say the example I gave you of the X and O part,
Right.
getting and writing about games and just writing a little bit too much about a certain game, that kind of
Right.
thing. But one other thing that's interesting to that, I think you might get a kick out of this. So you'll notice there's a poem from my mother in there. My mother has a poem that is in the front of the book, and right near the front of the book. And she had written one like 25 years ago, and you can't miss it. It's like in the first 3 or 4 pages. It's a fairly long poem. But anyhow, she had written it about 25 years ago, and I talked to her about maybe updating it and putting it in the book. And she was absolutely against it. She said, you don't need a poem in a hockey book, that kind of thing. And what sort of convinced her in the end, I said, well, how many poems do you think? So I said, but how many poems do you actually think are in hockey books? And she probably goes, not many. And I said, well, that's exactly my point. That might differentiate this one a little bit,
So what are some of the takeaways that you hope readers get from the book?
Well, one thing I hope is that I'm a big fan of college hockey, and there hasn't been as much of this type of thing written about college hockey, and I hope it'll give the sport a little bit more exposure. I think, ever since I was a young kid, I really loved hockey. I loved the game, and that's continued my whole life. And I just think sort of sharing some of that joy and potentially exposing more people to the sport. I think the guys who played for me, we weren't exactly winning championships all over the place, and it's a pretty neat thing, I think, keepsake for them as well. And just a little bit, I don't know, I guess sharing a few of my philosophies and sharing so much from so many others. If this book is about a lot of people that touched me along the way, then in many cases I'm going to be talking about them, at the book at the same time. So I think it has a little bit of an educational component like that too.
Right. Perfect. Well, so what's next for you, Gary?
When I was in college, I worked at the YMCA in Burlington, and then when I graduated, I still worked there for a couple of years, sort of part time, and then I did the coaching at Rice, and I became the camp director of their YMCA day camp, and there's some pretty good material, like Summer of '79 or Summer of '78. Those are the two I was a director, and we dealt with a lot of different types of kids, low income kids and others. And I think there's probably something that would be interesting. I don't know. It'd be a lot of research too, trying to find people from 40 years ago. But I guess to answer your question, that's the only other thing I've thought of at this point.
Right. Yeah. What would be your recommendation for someone to say, hey, Gary, I love your book. What's your recommendation for me to get a book published if somebody walked up to you for that?
Well, if they were, certainly if they're younger, at least younger than me, I would say, save a lot of things. I did save a lot of stuff. I save a lot of stuff that I wrote. I actually, right over here to the right of me, at the bottom of my bookcase here, about 6 really large notebooks, like 3 or 4 inch, that with almost every practice in my 32 years a day, I see probably 95 of those practices. So I would say, pay attention and save things like that. And if I had to do it over again, I would say, like, if they're younger and they're going to still be coaching for a while, I would say take a lot of notes, even if you don't ever write the book. If you do, it would be really advantageous to you.
All right. Well, and so, yeah, Gary, this has been fantastic chatting with you, and please make sure when you get your Summer of '78 memoir.
Yeah.
Out,
yeah. I know.
Back on.
Yeah.